Our beloved national state broadcaster, which must never be criticised or held to account in spite of its unmatched television, radio and digital footprint and the small matter of an annual income of £5 billion, has had another bruising week, with their highest paid star, Gary Lineker, wading into the issue of the war in Gaza and defending British Jewish licence fee payers by referring to the October the 7th massacre as the Hamas thing. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, has again criticised the corporation for not calling Hamas a terror outfit. It's hard to know how many more babies they would have to behead for the BBC to consider them bad people. Of course, the BBC bar for what is a terrible person is pretty low, given their handling of a few of their stars over the years. Now then. Well, the BBC's Chief Executive of News and Current Affairs, Deborah Turness, told the Sir Harry Evans Investigative Journalism Summit in London that the public are spending too much time in an echo chamber of news where they only hear and read views that align with their own beliefs. She said that when a broadcaster puts out impartial news, the public are offended and consider it an attack on their values. An affront. An affront, I tell you. Well, here's what we've got to do as an experiment. The BBC, right, should put out a show which is impartial, we can but wait, and let's decide how triggered we actually are by it. Now, in part, I agree with Deborah Turness. Media, particularly social media, which is unregulated, has become very tribal, which is bad for public discourse, bad for democracy, and it's creating an unhappier, more divided society in which we stop listening and stop learning. Which is why it would be great if the BBC could start making shows that were impartial. Why doesn't Deborah Turness take a leaf out of her own book and deliver coverage of Israel's response to October the 7th, which is impartial and balanced? At the moment, the former controller of BBC One and former director of television, Danny Cohen, has branded his former employer as institutionally anti-Semitic. And what about the alleged death toll in Gaza, which has been drastically reduced following a UN investigation? Where is BBC Verify when you need it? You'd have thought that given Deborah Turness's annual salary is £400,000, that she could leverage a bit of impartiality out of our national broadcaster. £400,000, folks. That's what I call an affront. Now, Jerry Hayes.
Yes.
Does the BBC have a problem with impartiality?
The BBC's got lots of problems. And, I think all three of us have worked for the BBC. And we know the sort of hoops we have to jump to be impartial. Sometimes it just doesn't work. I don't think there's an inherent I think there's an inherent anti-government bias in the BBC.
And is that every government or this one?
I think every government. I think every government.
And that would be healthy, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be. But I mean, the hoops we used to jump through. I mean, gosh, Liz, when you were doing stuff on the radio for them, I mean, you used to jump through hoops, didn't you?
Well, what I found was that the people who work there are very corseted. I'm talking about in broadcasting house in London, as opposed to, some of the regional stations, but where I've also worked. But, you get somebody who'll go in there, be earning 300, just short of a Hugh Edwards, and then getting a chauffeur-driven car, stepping out and getting in a BBC car or a paid-for licensed car to take them home. So they don't go on public transport. Probably don't do their own shopping. They have a car door delivered. They rarely venture outside the M25. And if you are a person that works there and goes out and shops and talks to people and goes up north to see your relatives and goes up north and sees how whole communities have changed culturally, demographically, and sees the deprivation in seaside towns that you used to go to for your holidays. But you don't see that if you work in BBC News. And they're all got jobs for life and they're all highly paid. And I used to have to put a red line. I was presenting breakfast on my own and I used to get these scripts given to me and I'd go in the morning early enough to put a red line through them because there were certain group thinks that you had to all adhere to. One was We all know that climate change is real and it's man-made. No, well, give me two people, one on either side, and we'll discuss it. No. And then the BBC actually declared that there was no question about the science, so you weren't even it wasn't necessary more to.
And I think we saw a similar narrative during COVID. We had to have lockdowns, we had to have masks.
Yeah, and the BBC's climate change coverage is just appalling because it starts with that premise every time. The other one was all immigration. We all know that all immigration is a good thing. Straight through.
So these were directives you were given whilst working for the BBC?
These were scripts that I was supposed to read, and I just wouldn't do it.
It is one of the problems that you face in the BBC because everything is required to be impartial, and nobody quite knows what impartiality is about. And if you get lots of phone calls from two different sides, you know, the Labour Party ring you up one moment and the Conservative Party ring you up the next, and they complain about things, you think you must be doing something right. I mean, that's the real problem of working in the BBC. You walk through the door and you think immediately you've been given your impartiality card. I don't quite take the point that Liz is making, because I think with climate change, there are fairly positive thoughts on climate change.
The vast majority of scientists believe that the planet is heating up and it's related to carbon emissions.
But if you're in the BBC, you're required to do 5 minutes on that 99% of scientists and their thoughts about climate change, and then you have to produce another 5 minutes opposing them.
No, you don't.
The thing is, Liz, briefly,
that's what impartiality is regarded as.
Yeah, but that's not the case.
Isn't the BBC the most impartial of all of the broadcasters and all of the news outlets compared to anybody else, including us? Because GBNews is a sort of an opinion-led current affairs discussion channel.
Well, I try to.
If you really, need to know what's going on in the world, is there a more trusted platform than the BBC? I don't think there is.
I would. That's why I try and move around and don't live in an echo chamber. But I definitely would say that the BBC.
Okay.
Right. Okay. I've lived it. That group think in the newsroom.
All right. And you'd argue that's a sort of North London group think.
Well, it's West London.
Islington. Of course. Mike, you think the BBC was impartial and is not anymore?
No, I don't think it was impartial, but I think it was more, the BBC was trusted far more than it is now.
I do.
I think now people are beginning to question it. They see GBNews, they begin to see opinions that they perhaps hadn't been subjected to, and suddenly
I suggest a reason, which I've given a lot of thought to over the years? It's when John Burt came in was it the early 90s?
Yes.
And said, right, a lot of programmes, especially on local radio, are going to be news-led. News is the thing. Entertainment's piffle, it's secondary. News presenters and journalists were encouraged to be celebrities. They're doing Strictly Come Dancing. No journalist should be doing Strictly Come Dancing. And they've all got above the station.
OK, well, listen, let's be clear that the BBC have millions of TV viewers and listeners every week. Any polling will tell you that the BBC is trusted and loved by the vast majority of taxpayers, so they're clearly getting something right. But I defend my right to debate this rather lavishly funded organisation. Continue to do that, I will.
May I just do one thing quickly?
Briefly.
What really surprised me is I was saying to people, they love GB News and all the rest of it. I said, well, just get it on the, on 5-1. Is it 515? I can't remember.
I'm terrible.
I know, whatever it is.
236.
236. But I haven't got a licence. And I hadn't realised you cannot get GB News unless you have a BBC licence.
There you go, outrageous. Or, of course, you can listen on the radio or watch us on YouTube or the GB News app.